By that time, I was called to the U.S. Senate, and I needed to cite that paper with the protocol in it. And I was waiting, and I was waiting, and I was waiting, and I was waiting, and nothing happened. And I kept contacting the publisher, and Taylor and Francis, and finally, Taylor and Francis, I finally got somebody on the phone, and they said, there's a problem with this paper. A problem would have been 2 months ago. This is already a done deal. It's already vetted. You already paid. The publication fees are substantial. I already paid them. It was done. They said, you have to go talk to the editor, who happens to be right down the hall from me. So I went right down the hall, and I talked to him. This is a senior editor, someone who's one of the most published people in medicine, the longest-standing editor of major journals, and Dr. Roberts. I said, Dr. Roberts, is there a problem with this paper? He goes, I've never seen this before. In 40 to 50 years of editing, this paper has been retrieved out of the National Library of Medicine, and now there's an administrative complaint that it overlaps too much with the first paper. The National Library of Medicine is a computer database. It's not operated by people. It's a computer database. There's something like 20,000 entries made per day. It doesn't do matching up of one thing versus another thing. It doesn't have this, all the overlap with prior papers, all that's vetted ahead of time. In fact, all that was vetted. I had a whole transmittal of what had happened. And when that happened, my face turned beet red. And I knew that something extraordinary had to have happened. It had to. It's impossible for someone to fish that out. It's impossible for someone to actually be able to ID this and realize that another treatment paper is coming. It's impossible. It is physically and from a computer technology impossible. I went home that night and I told my wife, I think that is an act of Satan. I think Satan had directly intervened in my life. And as things became more tense through 2020, I was called to the U.S. Senate, and I was the lead witness in a historic set of hearings, November 19th of 2020. I had to submit a U.S. Senate biography. I had to I got a speech writer because I had a 5-minute opening statement, and it has to have a certain format. So I hired a speech writer in Washington, and I did this, and it was negotiated with the Senate. It was accepted, and now all I had to do was read my speech. That's all I had to do. And my wife and I went to Washington. I was in the Kimpton Hotel, probably 600 rooms, and there was 3 people in the entire hotel. All of Washington was shut down. All the Starbucks around was shut down. We literally walked like 3 miles to find a restaurant open, and we went past the Smithsonian. Everything was closed down. I realized, wait a minute, Washington in the fall of 2020 was shut down. Our government wasn't meeting. Everything had been dissolved. So that night I was practicing my speech, and my wife was timing it, and she goes, you're not making it in 5 minutes. You're not making it. You're not making the time. And I just am not a good reader of a message. My habit is to do what I'm doing now, to do it with no prepared comments. I prepare it in my mind, but I speak extemporaneously. So I went to bed that night. I didn't sleep well. I was about on day 17 of COVID. I was recovering from COVID. I had a relatively severe case, so I was on steroids, and I wasn't sleeping that well. I hadn't had my hair cut in months. And so there I am. I'm on the Senate floor. Opening statements are given by Senator Johnson, who is the majority chairman, and then opening statements by Gary Peters from Michigan, who is the minority chairman. And Senator Johnson has no mask on. He's handsome, he's brilliant, and he's saying, I'm bringing doctors here to tell America where they have found success in treating patients. And Gary Peters left a black mask on, and Gary Peters said, well, what we're going to hear today, what I don't want America to do is to have any hope. He meant to say any false hopes, but it slipped out that he didn't want America to have any hope. He didn't want America to have any hope, and I'll just never forget that. Senate chambers are relatively empty. Most people aren't there. Some people are online. We were supposed to have Mitt Romney and Kamala Harris, and all, everyone's in abstention. So after the comments, I'm the first witness, and Senator Johnson said, Dr. McCullough introduces me. I look at this impossible 700-word speech in 5 minutes, and I look at it, I look at my timer, which I have 5 minutes, and that's it. And then I just turned that speech over, and I just went. And at that moment, I felt like a jolt of lightning went into my body. And my voice changed. I became aggressive. I became hyper-focused. I didn't miss a single word. I didn't stumble on a single point. I showed my protocols. I was clear. And when I concluded, I had concluded that American lives were being lost because early treatment was denied. And I had concluded that academic fraud had occurred in the literature, and I used those words. But when I finished and I looked down, it was 5 minutes, not a second more, not a second later. My heart rate had to be 140, yeah. And I basically realized something had really happened. And then the rest of the proceedings to me were like a blur. Even though it was hours, it seemed like it was over in minutes. And I went out to lunch in an empty restaurant with my wife in Washington, and I told her, I said, something just happened. Something happened. I felt the Holy Spirit come into me for those 5 minutes. And from that point on, I knew that this was way more than an academic debate. This was way more than science point versus science point. In my involvement in being called by the media, called by the Senate, I had previously been called by the White House. It just started to happen.